Alana, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's going to be good. I was telling you before we got on, my very this podcast episode has been, or this podcast has been around since 2018. My very first episode, Baby Lily, beginning healing journey, Baby Lily. First episode was what is codependency, and all I did was read definitions of what codependency was because I was so new to this
Yeah.
whole thing. So this will be interesting because you call yourself the codependent perfectionist, right? Or
I
perfect,
do.
yeah.
Yes.
Tell me more about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I call myself that because I want people to know that I'm in it with them. Like I'm all of those things. And I've been working on it for many, many years now.
Mhm.
Um, but it's still stuff that obviously I work through, on a daily basis, and just love helping other people work it through as well.
Yeah, yeah. I love your offerings too. Let's start with how do you define codependency?
So to me, codependency is one of those topics that in many ways feels so vast. Like like when I see it, I'm like, there it is, there it is, there it is. But it can be hard to like put one label on it. But the easiest way to explain it is really um, an emotional enmeshment with other people. Um,
Hmm.
and what that means is that a lot of our emotions are based on other people, how they're doing, our relationships with them, how they're feeling about us. So it's very other oriented in a sense. And that can show up in all different types of relationships. It could be at work, it could be in a romantic relationship, it could be in friendships, in your parenting. And I like to look at all of those different relationships and how it shows up because it could be somewhat different.
Totally. So emotional enmeshment.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds, yeah, familiar. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
so how does this happen? How does someone become quote unquote a codependent in their life in these different facets of their life?
So, again, there's not like one way that I think it happens, but I think it's a mix of things. And some of it has to do with our kind of natural born personality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some of it has to do, I believe, with the family that we grow up in and the role that we take on within that family. It can have to do with what type of parenting we received or what was going on with our parents. If they were struggling with a substance abuse or a mental health issue or a personality disorder, many of us can become codependent that way. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it even happens where we have an absent parent, and so we become the other parent's, emotional partner in a sense
Mm-hmm.
as the child. So, there's so many different ways it can happen, trauma, genetics. And I believe often it's a combination of all of those things in a sense.
Totally. Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm like, check, 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 check.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So, okay, got it. Um, I'm curious how you got into this work. It seems like that you, like you said, that this, it's something up for you. It's something that continuous, for me too. Like it's always, I think for me, the misperception I think people have about healing, and a part of me I think also had about healing is that, oh, this shit just goes away. And it really
Right.
doesn't. Um, yeah, I mean, and I think, just to manage expectations for myself and for people listening, um, I'd love to hear your story about like how you got into this.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm one of those people who somehow always knew I was going to be a therapist, which probably speaks to my codependency to begin. Because so many of us therapists are codependent, actually. That's why we go into the field, because we want to help and save other people. I actually have a whole training that's just for therapists on their own codependency because it's such a big issue for us.
Good, that's amazing.
Yeah. So, I from an early age, like was definitely more of a caretaker, always knew I wanted to help people in this way, was always very sensitive to emotions and kind of aware of them. I like to say I have an old soul. I believe that. I think I've been around this planet a few times. And so I kind of knew like what I was meant to do. And then at some point in my early adulthood, as I was kind of moving into becoming a therapist, I also knew I really needed to work on myself. And I didn't know what that entailed, but I knew I needed to get myself into therapy. And I did. And that's where I learned that I was codependent and that I was also a perfectionist. And that really started my journey. And, once I understood that and really understood the dynamic, how it was playing out in all of my relationships and how it was impacting my life, it was like, wow, I could just start to see it everywhere. And actually in my early career, I used to work in substance abuse primarily. And there is tons of codependency in the substance abuse world. And so it was so clear to me how negative relationships were being, or how negatively relationships were being impacted because of codependency with loved ones, with parents. And so that kind of started the journey. And then, I started working with parents of children with substance abuse and mental health issues, teens specifically. And that's kind of what made me know that I wanted to write a book about codependency and parenting, because I was like, wow, we got to talk about this, because if we could catch this early, it could really change some of these dynamics, and prevent a lot of the codependency that was so rampant in the relationships that I was working with people on.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It makes total sense. I love the humility, I think of which I think, I don't know, you've been in the game longer than I have for sure, but I think that that piece that you're talking about therapists working on themselves and how important it is for, for your side of the street to be cleaned up so you can help other people. I think that's just a beautiful example. I think it's getting better now. I don't know. I'd love to hear your opinion on this, but I can say like, in going to therapy, I've had like in the past, like pretty kind of disruptive, I think, kind of experiences with therapy, because there's this hierarchy thing going on. Like, I know better than you. And you could like me, of course, like I can feel energy. I can feel, like you're saying, like in tune with people's emotions. And I can tell when people, haven't done their work, but I didn't know it then, but it was just really disruptive for that experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I think some of us that are really sensitive to what's going on around us, we pick up on a lot of things, and it can be really difficult and challenging in so many ways. And yeah, if having the right therapist for you is so key to like the therapeutic work. If I would try so many therapists before, you feel like, yes, this is my person, because you're really entering into such an intimate journey that you have to feel like really connected, or you're not really going to get anywhere with that person. And I had such a strong connection with my therapist, that I can't imagine if I didn't feel that safe with her and didn't feel like she had, my best interest at heart and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like that's where the good, juicy healing comes, is that safety, with another person. Right.
Sure.
I think one of the things also, when you were talking about your journey with codependency, all of these things, these old kind of information and these old patterns kind of started bubbling up in me. And I'm not triggered, but it's just so interesting, because codependency, I think, people joke about like, oh, I'm codependent, and that annoys me. But
Yeah.
does it annoy you? Like,
Well,
girl, if you only knew that this is a bad pattern.
right. Well, I have found recently, I mean, I guess it's like a social media related thing, that there's like so much like awareness, but lack of awareness about therapeutic issues. So it's like this weird thing where like people know a lot of words, or they know like a lot of basics around things, and then they kind of regurgitate that stuff back, but they don't quite understand the depth of what that means. So I think things are thrown around so like flippantly nowadays, and it's tough for us as therapists, I think, because then when we're trying to really, hone in on something important, it could be like, oh yeah, I saw a TikTok about that. And I'm like, Okay, well, that's a start, and and of course, like, I mean, I'm on Instagram sharing things myself, so I don't hate the whole thing, but I also want people to understand, like, that's not therapy, or it's not meant to be there to, like, necessarily self-diagnose yourself, but more to provide some, like, starter information so that you continue the journey, hopefully with somebody who's got some real, good
Yeah,
experience.
totally. Yeah, totally. I love that you bring that up because that's something that has been, I started my coaching practice 2.5 years ago. And it's just, I know we're like saying the word codependent a lot today, right? Like it's a label, and just like abandonment wound is a label, or mother wound is a label, or father wound is a label. Exactly what you're saying is that I feel like when people think that they know what they need to heal, it's like not what they need to know at all, or that what they need to heal at all. And I say that with love, y'all, but like, I don't know. I think it's something, has something to do with like perfectionism and control and, like this A+ student mentality that we were all taught to be, so it's just so interesting.
Well, actually, I do find that some of the most difficult clients to work with are the people who have read the most about
Exactly.
self-help.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's
that's a
true.
sad thing to say. I mean, I wouldn't want it to be that way, but the reality is that sometimes, especially those of us who are like intellectual based, we can be so defended in that place. So we can learn a lot of stuff and know it in an intellectual way, but that doesn't mean that it translates into the actual therapeutic work that has to happen internally.
Yeah.
And so it can be really hard therapeutically because a lot of those people, like, may know the lingo, the information, but they're not necessarily putting it into practice, which is obviously the difficult step after
Mm-hmm.
getting the info.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. The A+ parts of us and the perfectionist parts of us are really, really strong. Us women
Yeah.
out there. I know you because it was me too. I see. Yes. I think the other thing too about codependency that is messed up that I'd love to kind of chat with you about is this, like, I don't know if it comes from society or comes from family upbringing or whatever, but this whole thing about like codependency gets confused, I think, with being caring or being loyal or, or something like that. Do you see that? And like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because, and sometimes I think with codependency, there's like it's very nuanced in nature, which is why I'm like very hesitant when, people think they kind of have it down, but haven't done the work yet. It's like, no, it's so nuanced. There's sometimes such a fine line between, being caring and caretaking somebody in a way that's codependent. And
Mm-hmm.
often, like, you have to really dig to figure out where it may have turned into codependency versus this place of just being loving and caring.
Mm-hmm.
And especially because I work with a lot of parents, that can be especially confusing because as a parent, you are a caretaker.
Right.
um, and you are responsible for your kids' well-being in a sense. And it can be really challenging. I mean, I'm a parent, so I know it myself, that it's very difficult sometimes to identify, like, is this codependency or am I actually just being supportive and loving? And so sometimes I have to kind of check in and say, well, who is this about? Like, is this about me or is this about them?
Mm-hmm.
Am I doing it in my best interest or their best interest? Am I putting their needs first, and is that appropriate right now? Am I doing it too much? Am I starting to feel resentful? Are there negative feelings coming up for me? And sometimes there's like a lot of check-ins that need to happen in these kind of more nuanced situations that can look like normal parenting, where I'm like, I don't, it's not always so clear.
Mm-hmm. That's
Right. So,
true.
so
Yeah.
yeah. And the point of recovering from codependency is not to become an uncaring, unloving person. The point
Mm.
of recovery is actually to become more loving and caring, which is an interesting thing and something I only recognized once, I really did the work, because what I realized is that, and my therapist would of course say this to me all the time, but I realized that we're actually not so loving when we're being codependent with other people, because we are trying to control, and it becomes this thing around what I need something to be, which actually isn't very loving, so when we can take a step back and detach in a loving way from the people around us, we actually can become more supportive in a sense.
That's so true.
It just looks very different, and it won't feel that same way to you at first, for those of you who are like, but it doesn't, that doesn't feel right. I'm like, it won't actually for some time, and then eventually you will be able to figure out how to be super loving and supportive to people, without sacrificing yourself.
100%.
And that can be like, that to me is when it's like winning for all people, rather than what we're used to, which is like, if you win, I lose, and that's not really how it should be. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. That has absolutely been my experience too with my healing is, it's hard to describe. Like, you're right. It's like really, really hard to describe in words. But it's this feeling of, like, for me, it's like this feeling of wholeness, of like power, but not in like abusive power, but just like alignment and strength. And it is like, again, like there's all these sayings out there on Instagram, like, oh, don't pour from an empty cup or whatever the freak it is. But like, you know what I'm saying? And like, people hear that, but it's like this very embodied, or for me, it was like this very embodied feeling of, I really have endless energy really to love people now. And like I even tell people, like people I don't even know, like on social media, I love you. And like me saying that, like probably a year and a half ago, 2 years, would have felt really weird, because it would have felt like I was like I was looking for some kind of like validation, or like, or some kind of reciprocity. But now it's just me expressing like true love, like the way that I want to express it. Yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because in codependency there usually is like a hidden expectation that,
Oh.
like, I'm going to say this or do this and you're going to do it back for me in some capacity. So like, we're not truly just giving to give, or expressing to express. We're like doing it but kind of expecting in return, in a sense, and often we're disappointed, of course. So I think what you're talking about is the place that we can get to in recovery, where it's more like, I'm just to share, and it's not about what you say back to me, or making sure it's always exactly even, but that you can just be giving, and not
Mm.
with resentment.
Yeah, and not sacrifice, like you said, the self-sacrifice piece. What do you see as the biggest kind of roadblocks to healing codependency?
Well, it's risky. I'll be honest with you. Like, it's all therapy is not without risk. And what that means
True.
to me is that, like, you have to be willing to let go of certain things that you might be holding on to really tightly for various reasons, usually fear, you know. And like in my own therapeutic work, there was several relationships that didn't last because of it, or others that just changed, and obviously my feeling is that that's what was meant to happen, but I can understand why that feels really scary for people, and they don't want the change in their life. I mean, change is scary, and it does require that we have to look at ourselves in a way that's tough, and be real, and get some harsh feedback. Like, it didn't actually feel good when my therapist told me I was codependent, but it was probably the most important thing I was ever told in my life, but it was also with love, and that's an important piece of it too, of course. But yeah, you have to be willing to take risks and see where it's going to go, and not be in control of it. And that's tough for most of us, to let go of the control, and to kind of see where the chips fall, and know that some things in our life are going to change, and that is okay and probably necessary.
Yeah, that's true. Very true. Man, it's always work, which is great. And I love, it's become a new paradigm for me. But yeah, it's It is scary for sure. You know, but I've learned to kind of reframe the fear that I feel personally about um I've learned to kind of listen to those little nudges now because I now know what the result is, which is like,
Right.
you know, a life of love, a beautiful partnership, an amazing, you know, career and all that stuff. Like, um, yeah. Anyways, yeah. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. I mean, the other side is like infinitely better than I think it was
Truth.
before. But
Truth.
because I think when you're on the beginning side of it, you have no idea what that means and what it looks like. It's hard to like imagine it, and it could take a long time to
Right.
get there. So I can understand people getting discouraged with the process, but yes,
Totally.
that's exactly where you're meant to land, which is that place of like freedom and peace and love. And
Mhm.
there's, I mean, there's so much positivity there. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah, it is. So let's get to juicy before we close up about you do a lot of boundary work. I love
Mhm.
boundary work. It's so good. I've totally reframed all the boundaries that I do because when I I always say that when I start to feel like I'm being a bitch, then I'm on the right path.
Right. There you go.
What are some common mistakes that people make when they try to put boundaries in place?
Oh gosh, I mean, probably the number one, well, there's a couple of them. Okay. One is lack of clear communication. Like people mentally think they've said things that they actually haven't said.
Mhm.
And that creates a whole lot of issue because they assume that the other person knows what they mean. And we should never assume that. We have to be very clear in our wording. And so that to me is like one of the main issues. The other big one that comes up is a lack of enforcement of the boundary. If you're not willing to follow through on a boundary, my like firm belief is don't put it in place. I'd rather you say nothing than
Mhm.
you put a boundary in place that you actually would never follow through on. And so to me, like if you're going to do that, that sabotages your credibility.
Mhm.
It hurts the trust in a relationship because people can't trust that you mean what you say. And it really sends a message to the other person. You could do whatever you want because I'm not going to do anything about it.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I think there's a lot of thought that needs to happen before a boundary ever is put into place. Like, and sometimes we have to think quickly because, like, with the kids, sometimes it's like you got to put a boundary in real quick.
Mhm.
But I'm always trying to think many steps ahead to think like, would I actually do that? And if my answer is no, I don't say it.
Mhm.
The empty boundary is like, you know.
Mhm.
So we have to be clear and we have to mean it
Okay.
and be truly willing. That if you have that, you're in a good spot. But I would also make sure, clarity wise, you may think you're a very clear, communicator, but you actually have to check in with the other person and make sure that they understood what you said. Because we all interpret things through our own our own lens of life. And so it's important that you check in and make sure that they really get what you're saying.
Mhm. Yeah, those are all really good points. Very hard though.
Oh, so hard.
So let's not gloss over that. Let's not gloss over
It
how,
is so
how
hard,
yeah.
and that's where someone like myself comes in because
Yeah.
I help people word things,
Mm-hmm.
and like truly like look at boundaries all the time because we're not really taught those skills of communication, and so no one should expect that they have them. But I'm happy to help people like
Mm-hmm.
really get like the exact. Sometimes like I will literally omit a word that I find will be entirely problematic to the whole dynamic that someone
Mm-hmm.
would never even think, but every single word I will be looking at.
Interesting. Okay. I think the thing too about boundaries that surprised me when I started to, like, because I started off being a floundering little boundary setter, Well, I started off really back in, in your world, Alana, when, I wouldn't hold up to my boundaries, and that did not end up well,
Right.
as you know. But then, floundering along, I remember like, just being really nervous, making it a big deal, inside myself, right? Like, and then progressing through, like going through kind of that little uncomfortable teenage stage, and then becoming like a boundary adult. And what surprised me when I got to this point where boundaries actually became very effortless, aligning, as clear as they could be. There are still times, in my partnership or with clients where I'm like, well, I'll say, I'm not really quite sure how to say this, or, I'll frame it with something that's true for me. Like, this feels really hard for me to say, but I'm going to say it anyways, or, whatever it is. But the thing that surprised me the most is how many times that you might have to repeat your boundary so that people can hear it and repeat it in different ways. That surprised me. And I think that, again, like adult boundary stage, right? Like, I'm a real adult, guys. I grew up. But I feel like that's very, like my nervous system is regulated. It's almost like talking to I don't have children, but I have nieces and nephews, but like talking to a child, like you have to just repeat again, again and again, calmly, with strength and power, and not like authority in a mean way, but just like what's true. So that surprised me a lot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think people probably don't expect that to be true, that they think like
Yeah.
I say it one time and people should get it. And I agree with you. Sometimes it does need to be said multiple times. I think if you find that the person is not listening to you, not respecting it, at some point you just have to enforce it, or something has to be done, because there has to be a boundary around your boundary, right? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, but you do have to give it time, especially when you're changing dynamics. Like, people aren't in the same place as you,
Mm-hmm.
when you're working on yourself. And that was hard for me to get to, like I was like, oh, I'm changing, everyone's changing. No, Alana, just you're changing.
Mm-hmm.
And some people will be okay with that and other people won't, or some people it will take some time for them to catch up with you. And so sometimes we have to give some grace to the people around us, that like we're learning something or changing something, and that it's hard for other people to change with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And I think some of my experience, like some of my friendship breakups have revolved around like, for example, um, I do not do any hard conversations via text anymore with no one ever. Not anymore. No hard conversations via text. That's a hard boundary for me. And I've had a couple friends during this stage of my life where I'm doing my healing and I'm doing my, cleaning up my side of the street, all that stuff where I said a couple times, like, I do not do hard conversations via text. Can we talk? And they wouldn't be, be able to, yeah, exactly. And so I think what's helpful with that boundaries is if it's not like, family's a different story, y'all. Yeah. But it really helps weed out your people, I think, too, right? Like, they don't have to listen. It's their choice to listen. But if you say that something's important to you, if you say why, if you're clear about how this affects you or how this affects your relationship or whatever, they may just not be your people. Like, maybe they're not on your level right now, and that's okay, right?
Yeah, I mean, listen, people change and evolve throughout their life. It's unrealistic to think that all of your relationships will naturally just flow with you throughout the
True.
entire span
Yeah.
of life. So yeah, and I think we can do that without judgment. Like, you're saying like, this is my boundary, and it's okay for someone to say that doesn't work for me. Like, and both of those are equally valid. Like, it's not like one's right and one's wrong.
True. Yeah.
It's like, I'm allowed to have a boundary and someone else cannot like that boundary, and that doesn't make them bad, because they might have other issues that are going on. And so sometimes we have to renegotiate our boundaries, and sometimes we have to stick to them because they're really important to us, and we're not willing to let them go, and so the relationship won't won't sustain through that. And maybe we'll meet at another time in life, but yeah, that has to happen sometimes.
Yeah, totally. So juicy. Oh, such a good conversation. Thank you, Alana. We're gonna close it up. Is there anything that you're working on right now? And you have any programs out? And where can people find you?
Sure. Yeah. So I just put together a digital workbook that is on codependency recovery. If anybody's interested, you can find it on my website. The easiest way to find my website is thecodependentperfectionist.com. And also, you can find me on Instagram, same the codependent perfectionist. And all of that it shows you what I'm working on, which includes the workbook, my book. I have oracle cards, which I love, especially for those of you who are working on relationship stuff. So yeah, check me out there, and hopefully some of that will be of interest.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much. You're amazing. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.